Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. Today we're tackling something that can make or break any project: risk management.
It's a big one for sure.
Yeah, and to help us navigate this complex topic, we're going straight to the source: the Project Management Institute's PMBOK guide.
An essential resource for any project manager.
Absolutely. And whether you're a seasoned pro or just starting your project management journey, get ready to level up your risk management game.
What's interesting is this guide really emphasizes proactive risk management. It's not just about putting out fires.
Right.
It's about strategically navigating uncertainty to set your project up for success.
No, we've all been there, right? Those project hiccups, the delays, the budget blowouts.
Yeah.
The PMBOK calls those unmanaged threats.
Yeah.
But it also highlights the flip side, those exciting project wins that come from actually capturing opportunities. And the document lays out 7 key processes, kind of like your risk management toolkit, to help you achieve exactly that.
Planning, identifying, analyzing, responding, implementing, monitoring, and controlling risks. It's a continuous cycle.
Okay, so you're constantly evaluating, adapting, and refining your approach.
Throughout the entire project, yeah.
Okay, I'm already feeling more strategic just hearing you explain this.
Yeah.
But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's define what we're actually talking about.
Sure.
The PMBOK says that project risk management, in a nutshell, is about increasing the likelihood of positive outcomes
Right.
while decreasing the chance of those negative ones.
Makes sense.
It sounds simple enough, but they also make a pretty clear distinction between individual risks and then the overall project risk.
Yeah, that's an important point.
Can you unpack that a little bit for us?
Absolutely. Imagine you're building a skyscraper.
Okay.
An individual risk might be something like a material shortage or a labor strike. Those are specific events that could really throw a wrench in your plans. But overall project risk is that bigger picture view. It's about considering how all those individual risks, along with other uncertainties, impact the likelihood of achieving your ultimate goal. A completed skyscraper that meets all the requirements.
Okay, so it's kind of like baking a cake, right?
I was going to say.
Those individual risks are like forgetting the baking powder or accidentally burning the edges.
Yep.
But overall risk is about how likely you are to end up with a delicious, presentable cake, considering all those potential mishaps.
Exactly. And what I find really interesting is that the PMBOK challenges us to reframe how we think about risk.
Okay.
It actually encourages organizations to choose to take on risk, obviously, in a controlled way.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying we shouldn't just try to avoid risk altogether?
Right. Think about it this way.
Mm.
If you constantly play it safe, you might miss out on those opportunities for innovation, for pushing boundaries.
Okay.
Calculated risks, where you've carefully considered those potential downsides and upsides, can actually be the key to those really remarkable outcomes.
So it's not about being reckless, but about being strategic and understanding your risk appetite.
That's a great way to put it.
How much you're willing to gamble to potentially reap those bigger rewards.
Exactly. Risk appetite is that sweet spot between playing it too safe and being overly reckless. It's understanding how much uncertainty you're comfortable with as an organization or as a project team.
And setting those clear thresholds right, for what's acceptable.
Absolutely.
I'm starting to see how this all connects to the bigger picture of project success. If you're aware of your risk appetite, you set those clear thresholds, you're kind of setting yourself up to make smarter decisions throughout the project.
Precisely. And it's essential to remember that risk management is a team effort.
Of course.
Stakeholders, project sponsors, the entire project team, they all need to be aligned on their risk appetite and those thresholds.
Yeah, I mean, if everyone's on the same page,
Right.
It just makes sense. You can avoid those miscommunications, those potential conflicts down the road. For sure. Okay, this is starting to make a lot of sense. We've laid some groundwork here, but now I'm curious about those specific types of risks we might encounter. I know we tend to fixate on those negative risks, those threats that could derail a project, but the PMBOK also emphasizes those positive risks, those opportunities. How do we differentiate between those two?
That is a great question. We often get so caught up in, firefighting those threats that we overlook those potential upsides.
Yeah.
Threats are those potential negative events that could hurt your project. So let's say a key supplier going bankrupt.
Okay.
Opportunities, on the other hand, are those positive possibilities that could lead to, exceeding expectations, like discovering a more efficient way to complete a task.
I see.
Recognizing and managing both is absolutely crucial for maximizing your project's success.
So threats are like those unexpected storms that could blow you off course, and opportunities are like those favorable winds that can propel you forward.
I like that analogy.
It's all about being able to see both, right? Spot those potential dangers and those advantages, those hidden advantages.
Exactly. And as the PMBOK points out, it's not just about those obvious event risks like a fire breaking out or a crucial piece of equipment failing.
Right.
We also need to consider variability risk, which stems from the uncertainty of how things might play out.
Okay. Variability risk. That's a new one.
Yeah.
What's a good example of that?
Let's say you're building a bridge.
Okay.
A variability risk might be that the strength of the steel fluctuates slightly from batch to batch. It's not a single event you can prevent, but it's something you need to consider.
Okay, so it's like baking a cake where the oven temperature might fluctuate a little bit.
Yeah, exactly.
Even if you follow the recipe precisely, you kind of have to be prepared to adapt your approach.
Exactly. It's recognizing that some things are inherently unpredictable and being prepared to manage that variability. And then there's ambiguity risk.
Ambiguity risk.
Which arises when, things are unclear or uncertain about the future.
Okay, so give me an example of that one.
Think about a project involving cutting-edge technology.
Okay.
There's often inherent ambiguity because you're dealing with the unknown. How will this technology actually perform in real-world conditions? How will it integrate with existing systems?
So it's like trying to bake a cake with a brand new oven that you'd never used before.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. You have an idea of what you want, but there's a level of uncertainty there.
Definitely.
And this actually brings us to another important trend in project risk management, the growing emphasis on project resilience.
Project resilience. Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
A resilient project is one that can withstand those inevitable surprises, those bumps along the way. It's about building in buffers, flexibility, adaptability.
Okay, so we've got individual risks, overall project risk, we've got threats, opportunities, and now we've got this idea of building a resilient project.
That's right. It's about having that holistic view.
Okay, it feels like we're really starting to put together a pretty comprehensive approach to risk management.
Exactly. And that's what the PMBOK provides, a structured framework for thinking about and managing risk.
Okay, it's like having a roadmap that guides you through that uncertain terrain of project management.
I like that.
This is fantastic stuff, but I can already hear some listeners thinking, this is great for, huge projects like skyscrapers, but how does this apply to my everyday work?
Yeah.
Those smaller projects. How do you know how much risk management is enough? What are the key factors to consider?
The PMBOK suggests tailoring your approach based on several factors, including the project's size, its complexity, its importance, and the development approach you're using.
Right, so a small, straightforward project might only need a really basic risk management plan.
Right.
Whereas a large, complex one with, high stakes might need a much more robust, detailed approach.
Exactly. It's like baking a cake. A simple sheet cake might just require a basic recipe.
But a multi-tiered wedding cake with those intricate decorations,
Exactly.
they need a much more detailed plan and a much more meticulous execution.
Precisely. And it's also important to consider whether you're using a traditional waterfall approach or a more agile approach.
Right.
Because they require slightly different risk management approaches. Waterfall, with its more linear phases, lends itself to a more sequential risk management process.
Okay.
But agile projects with those iterative sprints demand a more flexible, adaptable approach.
So it's about choosing the right risk management recipe for the specific project you're working on.
Exactly. One size does not fit all. And the PMBOK recognizes that.
And to ensure we're not just, winging it, the PMBOK highlights a crucial document, the risk management plan.
Absolutely. That's your foundation.
So let's talk about that plan. Why is it so crucial? And what goes into it?
The risk management plan is basically your project's risk management Bible.
Okay.
It outlines how you'll structure and execute your risk management activities throughout the entire project. Without it, you're essentially reacting to risks as they pop up instead of proactively managing them.
So it's like having that detailed recipe for your cake.
Mm-hmm.
It tells you what ingredients to use, how to combine them, how long to bake it.
Exactly.
And it even helps you troubleshoot those common problems.
Yep.
Without that recipe, You're basically just guessing,
Yeah.
and the chances of ending up with a delicious cake are pretty slim.
Absolutely. And one of the key elements of the risk management plan is defining those risk categories
Okay.
and creating something called a risk breakdown structure, or RBS.
Okay, risk breakdown structure.
Hmm.
That sounds a bit intimidating. Can you break it down for us?
Think of the RDS as a hierarchical tree structure that helps you systematically think about and categorize all the potential risks your project might face.
Okay.
So, for example, at the top level, you might have those broad categories like technical risks, management risks, external risks,
Right.
and then you break those down further into subcategories and individual risks.
Okay, so under technical risks, you might have subcategories like software bugs, hardware failures, those kinds of things.
Exactly. And then under each of those, you would list those specific risks.
Okay, so it's like creating this checklist of all the things that could go wrong with your project,
Exactly.
from ingredient quality to oven malfunctions.
Precisely. And this systematic approach ensures that you're considering that comprehensive range of risks, not just those most obvious ones.
Okay, yeah.
The RBS really helps you visualize those potential pitfalls and provides that framework for organizing and prioritizing your risk management efforts.
This is starting to make a lot of sense. By breaking down those risks into manageable categories, you're setting yourself up to identify and address them more effectively.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've got our risk management plan in place, our categories defined, our RBS set up. Now it's time to put on those detective hats and start uncovering those hidden risks. What are some tools and techniques that can help us with that?
One of the most effective techniques is brainstorming, bringing together a diverse group of stakeholders to tap into their collective knowledge and experience.
I love a good brainstorming session.
Me too.
It's like gathering your project team in a room, with a whiteboard, just letting those ideas flow freely.
Absolutely. Another valuable tool is using checklists.
Right.
Drawing on lessons learned from past projects, industry best practices, you can avoid those common pitfalls.
It's like having that trusty list of project management commandments.
Exactly. And of course, we can't forget expert interviews. Tap into the wisdom of those who have been there, done that.
Right, so it's like seeking advice from a seasoned chef before embarking on a complex baking project.
Exactly.
They've seen it all, they've made all the mistakes.
I've learned those lessons.
Exactly.
And once you've identified those potential risks, the next step is to really dig deeper and understand those underlying causes.
Okay.
That's where root cause analysis comes in.
So it's like figuring out why your cake sank in the middle.
Precisely.
Was it the oven temperature? The type of flour? Not enough baking powder?
By getting to the bottom of the issue.
We can make adjustments to prevent it from happening again.
Exactly. And once you've identified those risks and their root causes, you need a system for, recording and tracking them.
Right.
And that's where the risk register comes in.
The risk register. Okay, tell me more.
Think of the risk register as your central hub for all things risk-related.
Okay.
It's a document or spreadsheet that lists each identified risk, its potential impact, its likelihood, and those preliminary responses you've discussed.
So it's like a detailed inventory of all those potential project gremlins that could wreak havoc, along with notes on how to keep them at bay.
I like that. And a well-structured risk register is crucial for effective risk management.
Yeah.
It keeps you organized, provides a clear overview of the risk landscape,
Makes sense.
and it helps facilitate communication and collaboration among the project team.
This is all fantastic stuff. We've covered so much ground, from defining project risk and exploring tools and techniques for identifying those potential pitfalls.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still more to this risk management puzzle, right?
Oh, absolutely.
We've identified those risks, but now we need to analyze them.
Yeah.
We need to understand their potential impact and likelihood.
Exactly. That's what we're going to dig into next time.
All right, so we've got this list of potential project risks, big and small. But now we got to figure out which ones are really going to trip us up and which ones could have the biggest impact if they actually happen.
Yeah.
Where do we go from here?
Right, yeah. It's not enough to just have a list. We need to analyze those risks, understand their potential impact, how likely they are to actually occur. The PMBOK guide suggests two main approaches to this analysis: qualitative and quantitative.
Qualitative and quantitative risk analysis. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the difference?
So qualitative risk analysis, think of it like getting the expert opinion.
Okay.
It's about using your team's knowledge, their experience, to make these judgments about each risk.
So it's like having a group of experienced bakers assess a cake recipe.
Yeah.
They'd look at the ingredients, the instructions, and based on their past experience, they can point out those potential problems like, hey, if you don't add enough baking powder, the cake might not rise. Or be careful not to overmix or the batter will get tough.
Yeah, exactly. So in a project setting, you'd gather your team, review each risk, discuss its probability of occurring, and what the impact would be if it did. The PMBOK suggests using those clear, descriptive terms for these assessments.
Okay, so instead of just saying, oh, that risk seems kind of likely, you'd use more specific terms like high probability or low probability.
Exactly. And you do the same thing for the impact as well. High impact, moderate impact, low impact. That way, everyone understands the severity and it ensures that consistency across those assessments.
I can see how that would be really helpful, like a shared language for talking about risk,
Exactly.
so everyone's on the same page. But I imagine those conversations could get, pretty complex, especially with a lot of risks to consider. Is there a tool that can help visualize those qualitative assessments?
Absolutely. The probability and impact matrix.
Yeah, okay.
It's a simple grid that helps you categorize risks based on, you guessed it, their probability and impact. So those high probability, high impact risks are all in one corner. Those are the ones that need immediate attention.
Right.
And then you have the low probability, low impact ones in the other corner. Those you might just monitor, but not necessarily dedicate a whole lot of resources to.
So it's like this risk heat map highlighting those areas where you really need to focus your attention.
Yeah.
And because it's visual, it's just so much easier to grasp than a long list of risks with, descriptions.
Exactly. And what's great about it is that it helps you prioritize your risk management efforts. You can quickly see which risks pose the biggest threat to the project, and you can allocate your resources accordingly.
This is making a lot of sense. But I'm also curious about quantitative risk analysis. When do we bring in the numbers? What are the benefits of doing that?
Yeah, so quantitative risk analysis is typically reserved for larger, more complex projects, or when the qualitative analysis suggests we need a more precise evaluation.
So it's like calling in the forensic accountants, when you suspect there might be some serious financial irregularities.
I like that. Yeah, you need that deeper level of analysis. So quantitative risk analysis involves using mathematical and statistical techniques to model the effects of those risks on the project objectives. It's about bringing in data, running simulations, and getting that really clear picture of the potential impact.
Okay, so we're talking crunching numbers, running some pretty sophisticated simulations here. What are some of the tools and techniques that are used in quantitative risk analysis?
One of the most well-known is the Monte Carlo simulation. It's a very powerful technique for understanding the range of possible outcomes for your project, given those uncertainties that we've been talking about.
Monte Carlo simulation. I've heard whispers of this mythical beast. What does it actually entail?
Imagine running thousands of virtual what-if scenarios through a computer model, each with slightly different variations of the input variables. So, for instance, you might vary the cost of materials, the duration of certain tasks, or even the productivity levels of the team.
So it's like simulating thousands of parallel universes where your project plays out in all these slightly different ways, each with its unique set of, circumstances.
Exactly. And by running those simulations, you can see how those variations affect the overall project outcome. You might find that in some scenarios, the project finishes ahead of schedule, under budget,
Wow.
while in others, there might be significant delays and cost overruns.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
can see how that would be really valuable, instead of just relying on our best guesses or, gut feelings, we're using data. We're using simulations to get a much more realistic picture of what could happen.
That's right. And the output of the Monte Carlo simulation gives you a range of possible outcomes and their probabilities. So that can help inform your decision making. For example, you might allocate more contingency reserves if the simulations are showing a high probability of cost overruns.
It's like having a crystal ball that shows you all these multiple possible futures for your project, so you can be prepared for the most likely scenarios.
That's a great way to put it. And in addition to the Monte Carlo simulation, there's another powerful technique called sensitivity analysis.
Sensitivity analysis. Okay, what's that?
So sensitivity analysis helps you pinpoint those risks that have the biggest impact on your project's success or failure. It tells you which variables are the most influential, so you can really focus your risk management efforts on those areas.
So it's like figuring out those critical ingredients in a recipe or those baking steps that are most likely to make or break your cake, right?
Exactly. You get those right, and everything else should fall into place.
And to help visualize those results, is there a particular tool used for that?
A common way to visualize that is the tornado diagram.
Tornado diagram, okay.
It's a chart that visually ranks the risks by their potential impact on the project. So those risks with the longest bars, they're the ones that have the biggest influence.
Okay, so the ones that could really, cause some damage if we're not prepared.
Exactly, like a tornado sweeping in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm really starting to see how all these tools and techniques work together to create this comprehensive picture of the risks we face.
Yeah.
We're not just blindly stumbling through the project. We're actually analyzing, assessing those risks to make those informed decisions.
Exactly. We're not just hoping for the best.
So where do we go from here?
Now that we've completed that risk analysis, both qualitative and quantitative, we're in a much better position to start planning those risk responses.
All right, that's what I want to talk about. How do we actually deal with these potential problems? What are the next steps?
That's what we'll be digging into next. It's about moving from analysis to action.
Welcome back, everyone. We've identified those pesky project risks, we've analyzed their potential impact, and now it's time for the main event. Planning those risk responses. So like we've done all this intel gathering, we've assessed the battlefield, and now it's time to actually deploy our strategic maneuvers.
Exactly. It's time to move from analysis to action. Risk response planning is all about developing those strategies to address those threats and opportunities we've identified.
Right, so we're not just letting those risks boss us around. We're taking control, charting our own course. But, with all those potential risks, where do we even begin? How do we decide, which ones to tackle first and what strategies to actually use?
Well, that's where prioritization comes in. Remember that probability and impact matrix we talked about?
Yeah.
That's our guiding light. Focus on those high probability, high impact risks first. Those are the ones that could really derail the project if they actually happen.
Makes sense. It's like focusing on those ingredients in your cake batter that are most likely to cause a disaster if you don't handle them properly.
Right.
The eggs, the flour, the baking powder, those are the ones that you measure precisely and mix carefully.
Exactly. And once we've prioritized those risks, we need to choose the right strategy for each one. The PMBOK actually outlines several strategies for addressing those threats, like avoiding, mitigating, transferring, and accepting.
Okay, let's break down those strategies. Avoiding a risk, that sounds pretty straightforward. Is it really as simple as it sounds?
Sometimes, yeah. Avoiding a risk might involve changing the project plan altogether to eliminate the risk. So let's say you're concerned about a potential shortage of a key material, you might choose a different design that uses a more readily available material instead.
So it's about being proactive, eliminating that threat before it even has a chance to, rear its ugly head.
Precisely.
What about mitigating a risk? Is that about, minimizing the damage if it does occur?
That's right. Mitigating a risk means taking steps to reduce the probability or the impact of the risk if it were to occur. So, for instance, if you're worried about delays in getting those permits, you might start the application process earlier. Give yourself more buffer time.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's like double-checking your oven temperature and setting a timer to reduce the risk of, burning your cake.
Exactly.
Okay. I'm starting to see a pattern here. It's about being proactive, taking steps to control those risks, whether we're eliminating them entirely or just kind of reducing their potential impact.
Yeah.
What about transferring a risk? Does that mean passing the buck to someone else?
You got it. Transferring a risk means shifting that responsibility to a third party. So, for example, you might purchase insurance to cover the risk of damage to your equipment.
Okay.
Or hire a specialized contractor to handle a particularly risky part of the project.
So it's like having that cake insurance policy, right? That covers you if your oven explodes or calling in a professional cake decorator to, handle those intricate designs that you're not quite sure you can pull off yourself.
Exactly. And then there's accepting the risk. This might sound a little passive,
Okay.
but it's actually a conscious decision to acknowledge a risk and just choose not to take any proactive action.
So it's like saying, okay, we know there's a chance our cake might not rise perfectly, but we're willing to take that risk and see what happens.
Exactly. You might choose to accept a risk if the cost of mitigating or transferring it outweighs that potential impact. It's a calculated decision based on your risk appetite, the specific circumstances of the project.
Okay, so we've got those strategies for dealing with threats. But what about opportunities?
Yeah.
How do we approach those positive possibilities?
Just like with threats, there are specific strategies for managing opportunities. You can exploit it, you can share it, you can enhance it, or you can accept it.
Okay, exploit, share, enhance, accept. Let's unpack those. Exploiting an opportunity, that sounds like really seizing the moment, making the most of it.
Exactly. Exploiting an opportunity means taking action to ensure that it happens and really maximizing that positive impact. So, for instance, if you discover a more efficient way to complete a task, you might exploit that opportunity by adjusting your project plan to implement that new approach.
Okay, yeah. What about sharing an opportunity? Is that about collaborating with others to make it even bigger and better?
That's right. Sharing an opportunity involves partnering with another organization or individual who can help you really capitalize on it. So, for example, you might share an opportunity to develop a new product with a company that has complementary expertise.
And enhancing an opportunity, does that mean kind of amplifying those positive effects?
Exactly. Enhancing an opportunity is taking those steps to increase the probability or the positive impact of that opportunity. So, for instance, you might assign your top performers to a task that offers that significant opportunity to really exceed those expectations.
Okay. And accepting an opportunity that sounds a bit passive, why would you just accept an opportunity instead of, grabbing it with both hands?
Accepting an opportunity means you acknowledge that it exists, but you choose not to actively pursue it. You might do this if the potential benefits don't outweigh the costs, or if pursuing that opportunity would just distract you from those core objectives.
Okay, so we've covered those strategies for both threats and opportunities. But what happens when, things don't go according to plan, even with those strategies in place? Is there anything else we can do?
That's where those contingent response strategies come in. These are backup plans that are triggered if certain conditions are met.
So it's like having a plan B, maybe even a plan C up your sleeve,
Right.
just in case things go sideways.
Exactly. For example, if you're managing the risk of a key supplier going bankrupt, your contingent response strategy might involve having a backup supplier already lined up and ready to go.
Okay, that makes sense. This is all making a lot of sense. We're not just passively hoping for the best, we're actively planning and preparing for those potential bumps along the way. But I have to ask, is there ever a point where, a risk is just too big to manage, where we kind of have to wave the white flag and say, you know what, this project's just too risky, we're not going to do it?
Hmm. That's a great question, and it's definitely something that every project manager should consider. There are absolutely times when the risks outweigh the potential rewards, and it's just wiser to walk away than to try to force it.
So it's like assessing that cake recipe and realizing, you know what, this is just too complex, too time consuming, or too risky for, my skill level and my resources.
That's a perfect analogy. And it's important to remember that risk management is not a one-time activity, it's an ongoing process. As the project progresses, new information emerges. You might need to revisit and adjust those risk responses.
So flexibility and adaptability are key here. We're not just following a rigid set of rules, we're constantly evaluating, adjusting our approach based on, the ever-changing landscape of our project.
That's right. And that actually brings us to the final stage of risk management, which is monitoring and controlling those risks throughout the project lifecycle.
Okay, so we've put all this effort into planning those risk responses, but how do we make sure those plans are actually being executed? It's like having that brilliant recipe for a cake, but then, forgetting to preheat the oven or accidentally using salt instead of sugar.
Right. Having a plan is useless if it's just sitting on a shelf somewhere. Monitoring involves tracking those responses, seeing how effective they are, and identifying any new risks that might pop up, making adjustments along the way.
It's like keeping a close eye on that cake as it bakes, right?
Exactly.
Checking the oven temperature, adjusting the time if needed, and being ready to step in if it starts to burn.
Precisely. Just like a good baker keeps an eye on their creation, a project manager stays vigilant throughout that project lifecycle. It's about gathering data, analyzing trends, and communicating regularly with the team to stay ahead of those potential problems.
Wow, this deep dive into project risk management has been incredible.
Yeah.
We've covered so much. We've defined risk, explored the different types, learned about those analytical tools, those response strategies, the importance of monitoring. It's been a whirlwind.
It's been my pleasure.
And for our listeners, we hope you've gained some valuable knowledge, some actionable advice that you can apply to your own projects. Remember, effective risk management is a journey. Embrace the challenge, stay vigilant, and never stop learning.
And don't be afraid to take those calculated risks. Sometimes a little bit of risk is all it takes to achieve those truly extraordinary results.
That's great advice. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into project risk management. We'll see you next time for another exciting exploration into the world of knowledge.